Sometimes, the people we spend a lifetime searching for are standing only a few feet away, waiting for a question no one has ever dared to ask. Those words would have sounded impossible to me just 1 week ago. My name is Emily Carter. I am 26 years old, and I have worked the breakfast shift at Willow Creek Diner in Boston for almost 4 years. Most mornings followed the same quiet rhythm. Fresh coffee filled the air before sunrise. The regular customers sat at their favorite booths. Truck drivers ordered pancakes. Office workers rushed through eggs and toast before heading downtown. It was an ordinary life, and I had learned to appreciate ordinary things. My grandmother always told me that peace was worth more than luxury, and after everything she had sacrificed to raise me, I believed her. She never spoke much about my parents. Whenever I asked about my father, she would gently smile, change the subject, and remind me that the people who stayed were more important than the people who disappeared. I stopped asking years ago, although part of me never stopped wondering. The only clue she had ever given me was a delicate silver necklace resting against my neck. Inside the tiny heart-shaped locket was half of an old photograph, faded by time until the faces could barely be recognized. "Never lose it," Grandma would whisper every birthday. "One day it will matter more than you can imagine." I never understood what she meant. That Tuesday began like every other shift. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I balanced 3 plates along my arm and greeted customers with the same smile I had practiced thousands of times. Around 9 o'clock, a sleek black sedan stopped outside the diner. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door for an older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit that looked more expensive than my yearly salary. I recognized him immediately from local business magazines displayed near the cash register. Richard Bennett, founder of Bennett Global Holdings. One of the wealthiest men in New England. People whispered that he owned hotels, technology companies, and charities across the country, yet every article also described him as a private man who rarely appeared in public. The entire diner seemed to pause as he quietly walked inside. He ignored the curious stares and chose a corner booth by the window. I picked up a menu, walked over with my usual smile, and asked if he was ready to order. Instead of looking at the menu, his eyes locked onto the silver necklace around my neck. His face lost all color. His hand trembled ever so slightly as he stood from the booth. Then, in a voice so quiet that only the nearest tables could hear, he asked the question that made the entire restaurant fall completely silent. "Excuse me, are you, my daughter?" For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The coffee pot in my hand suddenly felt twice as heavy, and every conversation inside the diner disappeared into complete silence. I stared at the man standing in front of me, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of strange joke. There was none. His eyes were filled with hope, fear, and a sadness so deep that it almost frightened me. I forced a nervous smile and quietly shook my head. "I think you have the wrong person, sir." My voice sounded much calmer than I actually felt. Around us, customers exchanged confused glances. One elderly couple lowered their newspapers. A little boy stopped eating his pancakes. Even Martha, the diner manager who had worked there for more than 20 years, stood frozen behind the register. Richard Bennett did not move. Instead, he looked at the silver necklace resting against my neck as though he had seen it before. "May I ask where you got that necklace?" he said softly. Instinctively, I placed my hand over the small heart-shaped locket. "It belonged to my family," I answered. "My grandmother gave it to me when I was a little girl." He closed his eyes for just a second before taking a slow breath. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not mean to embarrass you. It is only, that necklace looks exactly like one that belonged to someone I lost a very long time ago." His words caught me off guard. There was no arrogance in his voice. No sense of entitlement. Only quiet regret. Martha walked over and gently asked whether everything was all right. Richard immediately apologized for causing a scene and assured everyone that he would leave if necessary. Instead, I surprised myself by saying, "It is fine." I did not know why I said those words. Perhaps because something about the way he looked at the necklace reminded me of the expression my grandmother wore whenever she thought I was not watching. Richard slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed an old leather wallet. From it he carefully unfolded a faded photograph that had clearly been opened thousands of times. Time had damaged the edges, and part of the picture was missing, torn cleanly down the middle. He placed it gently on the table without saying another word. My heart skipped a beat. The torn edge of his photograph looked strangely familiar. I swallowed hard before opening my own tiny locket with trembling fingers. As I looked down at the faded half of the photograph inside, an impossible thought crossed my mind. The two torn pieces appeared as though they might once have been a single picture. Neither of us reached for the photographs. We simply stared at them, separated by a worn wooden table that suddenly felt like the distance of an entire lifetime. My hands trembled as I carefully removed the tiny picture from inside my locket. The edges were faded, softened by years of being carried close to my heart, yet the torn line looked almost identical to the one on Richard's photograph. Martha quietly asked another waitress to cover my tables, sensing that something much bigger than breakfast orders was unfolding. Richard slowly slid his photograph closer but stopped before it touched mine. "May I?" he asked. I nodded. With extraordinary care, he placed the two pieces side by side. A quiet gasp escaped from Martha. The jagged edges matched almost perfectly. The image revealed a young woman holding a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket while a smiling young man stood beside them with one hand resting protectively on the mother's shoulder. Time had faded their faces, but there was no doubt that the picture had once been whole. I looked up at Richard, unable to find the right words. He was no longer looking at the photograph. He was looking at me, and tears filled his eyes without a single one falling. "Her name was Grace," he whispered. "She was my wife." My heart pounded. I had never heard that name before. My grandmother had never mentioned it. Richard swallowed before continuing. "Our daughter disappeared after a terrible hospital evacuation 25 years ago. There was confusion, missing records, and too many unanswered questions. We searched for years. Every lead ended the same way. Nothing." I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything. My grandmother always told me my parents died before I could remember them. Saying those words aloud suddenly felt strange, almost uncertain. Richard nodded slowly, not arguing with me. "Then perhaps she believed she was protecting you," he said gently. "Or perhaps there is another explanation that neither of us knows yet." I closed the locket and slipped it back around my neck. Questions rushed through my mind faster than I could answer them. Why had Grandma hidden the photograph? Why had she insisted I never remove the necklace? Why had she avoided every conversation about my father? Richard reached into his jacket and removed a simple white business card. He placed it beside my coffee cup without pushing it toward me. "I am not asking you to believe me today," he said quietly. "I am only asking for the chance to discover the truth together, if you ever decide you want the answers." Before I could respond, he stood, thanked Martha for the coffee he had barely touched, and walked toward the door. Just before stepping outside into the rain, he turned back one final time. There was hope in his eyes now, but it was carefully restrained, as though he had learned long ago that hope could be a dangerous thing. I watched the black sedan disappear down the street, then slipped the business card into my apron pocket. That evening, for the first time in my entire life, I walked through my grandmother's front door carrying a question that could change everything. The familiar scent of cinnamon and old books greeted me as I stepped into my grandmother's small house just before sunset, but for the first time it did not feel comforting. It felt as though every photograph on the wall and every piece of furniture might be hiding an answer I had spent my entire life searching for. Grandma Evelyn was sitting in her favorite chair, knitting beside the living room window. She smiled the moment she saw me, yet her smile faded almost instantly when she noticed the expression on my face. "Emily," she said softly, "what happened?" I walked toward her without taking off my coat. My fingers slipped into my apron pocket and wrapped around Richard Bennett's business card. For several long seconds I could not bring myself to speak. Then I quietly placed the card on the coffee table. Grandma looked down at the name. The knitting needles slipped from her hands and landed on the floor with a gentle clatter. She did not reach for them. She simply stared at the card as though she had seen a ghost. My heart began racing. "You know him," I whispered. She closed her eyes. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt endless. When she finally opened her eyes again, they were filled with tears I had never seen before. "Where did you meet him?" she asked. I told her everything. The diner. The necklace. The photograph. The question that had stopped an entire room. I even described the way the torn photographs fit together almost perfectly. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When I finished, she slowly stood and walked toward the hallway. For a moment I thought she was avoiding the conversation again, just as she always had. Instead, she disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box that I had never seen before. The edges were worn smooth with age, and a tiny brass key was tied around it with faded blue ribbon. She placed the box on the table between us but did not open it immediately. "I always prayed this day would never come," she said quietly. "Not because I wanted to lie to you, but because I wanted you to have a peaceful childhood." My throat tightened. "Grandma, who am I?" Her shoulders trembled as she unlocked the box. Inside were carefully folded letters, a yellowed hospital bracelet, several old newspaper clippings, and a birth certificate. Sealed inside a clear protective sleeve. Resting on top of everything was another photograph, untouched by time, showing the same young couple from the torn picture smiling as they held a newborn baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Grandma gently picked up the photograph, looked at it for a long moment, and then whispered the words that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. "Before you decide whether to call Richard Bennett, there is something you deserve to know about the night you came into my arms." Grandma held the photograph with both hands as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. She took a slow breath before looking into my eyes. "Everything I am about to tell you is the truth as I remember it," she said quietly. "Some answers were stolen from all of us years ago, but I never lied about loving you." I sat beside her without speaking. The room was so still that I could hear the old clock ticking in the hallway. She carefully unfolded one of the letters from the wooden box. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age, yet the handwriting remained clear. "Your mother, Grace, wrote this only a few days before you were born," Grandma explained. "She asked me that if anything ever happened, I would protect you before anything else." My eyes filled with tears as Grandma continued. "The night you disappeared from the hospital was filled with confusion. Families were separated. Records were misplaced. People were searching for loved ones in every direction. Hours later, someone placed a baby into my arms and told me they believed you were Grace's daughter. I searched for your parents. I contacted the authorities more than once. Every answer I received was the same. They could not confirm anything." She handed me the hospital bracelet from the box. The tiny plastic band had faded, but one word could still be read. "Emily." I gently ran my finger across the letters. "Then why did you never tell me any of this?" I asked. Grandma lowered her head. "Because after months became years, everyone believed your parents were gone. I was terrified that if I reopened old questions without proof, someone might take you away from the only home you had ever known. I chose certainty over hope. I have wondered every single day whether I made the right decision." Her voice broke for the first time. I reached across the table and held her hand. Whatever mistakes had been made, I knew the woman sitting beside me had devoted 26 years to raising me with kindness, patience, and unconditional love. That truth could never be erased. We sat together in silence until she looked toward the business card still resting on the coffee table. "If Richard Bennett truly believes you may be his daughter," she said softly, "then both of you deserve the truth. Not guesses. Not memories. The truth." I nodded slowly. My hands were still trembling as I picked up my phone. For several minutes I stared at the number printed on the card without pressing a single button. Finally, I took a deep breath and called. It rang only once before a familiar voice answered immediately, as though he had been waiting beside the phone. "Emily," he said gently. "Thank you for calling." I closed my eyes for a moment before speaking. "I think we need to find out what really happened 25 years ago." The following afternoon I met Richard Bennett in a quiet family law office instead of his corporate headquarters. That surprised me. I had expected polished marble floors, assistants in expensive suits, and a room designed to impress people. Instead, he had chosen a place that felt calm, private, and ordinary. It was the first sign that this meeting was not about wealth. It was about answers. Richard stood as soon as I entered. He smiled gently but kept a respectful distance. "Thank you for trusting me enough to come," he said. I nodded, still uncertain about everything except one thing. Neither of us wanted to build our future on assumptions. An attorney greeted us warmly before introducing a licensed laboratory specialist who explained the DNA process step by step. Every form was reviewed carefully. Every question was answered. There was no pressure and no dramatic promises. Before either sample was collected, Richard looked at me with remarkable sincerity. "Emily, if the results show that I am mistaken, I will respect that completely. I will never disturb your life again. But if there is even the smallest chance that you are my daughter, I owe it to both of us to learn the truth." His words settled something inside me. I realized he was not chasing an inheritance, publicity, or recognition. He was chasing peace after 25 years of uncertainty. We completed the paperwork, and the technician carefully sealed the samples for testing. The results would take several days. As we prepared to leave, Richard noticed me glancing at the framed family photographs hanging in the hallway. "Would you have lunch with me?" he asked. "No interviews. No lawyers. Just lunch." After a brief hesitation, I agreed. We chose a small neighborhood cafe a few blocks away. He insisted on standing in line like everyone else instead of asking for special treatment. During lunch he never asked me to call him Dad. He never spoke about his companies. Instead, he asked about my favorite books, whether I enjoyed working at the diner, and how my grandmother was feeling. I found myself laughing more than I expected. He even admitted that he had burned pancakes so badly once that the smoke alarm had called more attention than the breakfast itself. It was such an ordinary story that I forgot, for a moment, I was sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in New England. Before we left, he quietly handed me a small paper bag. "This is not a gift," he said with a smile. "It is just a slice of apple pie. The waitress told me it is your favorite, and I thought your grandmother might enjoy sharing it with you." As I watched him walk to his car, I realized something unexpected had already begun. Long before the laboratory revealed a single result, a stranger was slowly teaching me what a caring father might have looked like all along. 4 days felt longer than 4 years. Every time my phone vibrated, my heart skipped a beat, only to discover another work schedule, another grocery reminder, or a message from a friend asking whether I wanted to trade shifts. Life continued moving, yet everything inside me felt suspended between two possible futures. During those days Richard never called unexpectedly. He never sent expensive gifts or tried to influence me. The only message he sent each morning was exactly the same. "I hope you and your grandmother have a peaceful day." Nothing more. Nothing less. Somehow, that simple consistency meant more than grand gestures ever could. On Friday afternoon my phone finally rang. It was the attorney's office. The laboratory report had arrived. They asked whether both of us could come in together. I looked across the living room where Grandma Evelyn was quietly watering her favorite flowers by the window. She saw my expression before I spoke a single word. Without asking any questions, she gently took my hand and whispered, "Whatever happens today, you have always been loved." An hour later we entered the conference room. Richard was already there, standing beside the window with his hands folded in front of him. The moment he saw Grandma, he walked toward her. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then he quietly said, "Thank you, for raising the little girl I could not find." Tears filled Grandma's eyes as she nodded. The attorney placed a sealed envelope on the table. No one rushed to open it. It felt as though every heartbeat inside the room carried the weight of 25 unanswered years. Finally, the attorney carefully unfolded the report and adjusted his glasses. The laboratory compared multiple genetic markers using current accredited testing standards, he began. I could barely breathe. Richard looked down at the table instead of at me. The attorney continued reading. The probability of a biological parent-child relationship exceeds 99.9%. The room became perfectly still. I heard Grandma quietly begin to cry. Richard covered his face with one hand, not out of celebration but from overwhelming relief. After a long moment he looked at me with eyes filled with gratitude rather than triumph. "Emily," he whispered, "I have dreamed about hearing those words for half my life." I felt tears running down my own face before I even realized I was crying. Yet before anyone could say another word, Grandma slowly reached into her purse and placed a carefully folded letter on the table. "The test answers one question," she said softly. "But this letter answers the one that matters even more." Grace wrote it the day before she disappeared, and until now I was never brave enough to let anyone read it. Grandma carefully unfolded the letter with trembling hands, protecting the fragile paper as though it were one last conversation frozen in time. The room remained silent while she passed it to Richard. He stared at the familiar handwriting for several seconds before his voice broke. "It is Grace's," he whispered. He looked at me. "I have not seen her handwriting in 25 years. He began reading aloud. "My dearest Richard, if you are holding this letter, then life has taken a path neither of us ever wanted. I need you to know one thing above everything else. If anything separates us, never believe it happened because I stopped loving you. Promise me that if our daughter grows up without us together, you will teach her that kindness is stronger than fear. Teach her that forgiveness is not weakness. Teach her that family is built every single day through love." Richard paused, unable to continue for a moment. Tears quietly rolled down his face. Grandma gently took the letter and read the final paragraphs. "If someone must protect our little girl until you can find her, do not blame them. They are only trying to keep her safe. The greatest gift you can ever give our daughter is not wealth. It is peace." Every word seemed to erase another layer of misunderstanding that had separated our lives for decades. Richard looked toward Grandma with deep gratitude. "You were never my enemy," he said softly. "You became the mother Emily needed when I could not be there." Grandma shook her head. "I never wanted to replace anyone. I only wanted a little girl to grow up feeling loved." Richard slowly walked across the room and gently embraced her. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, sincere, and filled with respect. Watching them, I realized something important. My life had never been built on a lie. It had been built on sacrifice from people who each believed they were protecting me the best way they knew how. Richard then reached into his briefcase and removed a thick folder. I expected legal documents, financial papers, or something connected to his business empire. Instead, he placed dozens of old photographs across the table. Every birthday he had imagined. Every school graduation he had pictured. Every Christmas card addressed to a daughter he never stopped hoping was alive. For 25 years he had quietly celebrated milestones that never happened, refusing to let hope disappear completely. I picked up one drawing of a little girl flying a kite beside a man with gray hair. Across the bottom he had written, "Maybe next year." My heart ached as I realized he had never truly given up. Looking at those carefully preserved memories, I understood that our reunion had not begun with a DNA report. It had begun decades earlier with a father's decision to leave a place in his heart empty until the day his daughter finally came home. Life did not transform overnight, and I was grateful for that. There was no dramatic move into a mansion, no press conference, and no attempt to erase the 26 years that had shaped who I had become. The following Monday I returned to Willow Creek Diner before sunrise, tied on my apron, poured fresh coffee, and greeted the regular customers with the same smile I always had. Around 9 o'clock, the familiar black sedan pulled quietly into the parking lot. Richard walked inside carrying nothing more than a newspaper and a warm smile. He chose the same corner booth by the window where everything had begun. This time, when I brought his coffee, he looked up and asked, "How is your grandmother today?" I smiled. "She said you still owe her a game of chess." He laughed, promising he would lose with dignity. Week after week, our relationship grew through ordinary moments instead of extraordinary events. We shared breakfasts, long conversations, family recipes, and stories about the years we had missed. Richard listened far more than he spoke. He wanted to know my favorite childhood memories, the teachers who encouraged me, the books I loved, and the dreams I had never shared with anyone. When he offered to help me financially, I thanked him but explained that I wanted to continue earning my own way. He respected that immediately. Instead of buying me a new life, he quietly supported the one I had already built. He donated anonymously to the community literacy program where my grandmother volunteered and never mentioned his name unless someone else did first. One Sunday afternoon, the three of us visited Grace's memorial garden for the first time together. We placed fresh white lilies beneath a small maple tree and read her letter once more. This time, the words felt different. They no longer sounded like a goodbye. They sounded like a promise finally fulfilled. As we prepared to leave, Richard hesitated for a moment before looking at me. There was uncertainty in his eyes, the kind that only appears when something truly matters. "Emily," he said quietly, "there is something I have wanted to ask since the day we met, but I never wanted to rush you." I reached over and gently took his hand. Before he could finish the question, I smiled through tears that no longer came from sadness. "You do not have to ask." My voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried every answer he had waited 25 years to hear. "Let us go home, Dad." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by a single word that meant more than every success he had ever achieved. As we walked toward the car together, I looked back once at the diner where a stranger had asked an impossible question. I realized that family is not measured by the years we lose, the money we own, or the mistakes that separate us. Family is built the moment people choose love over fear, truth over silence, and hope over despair. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding the person you lost. It is discovering that they never stopped searching for you either.